There's been a lot of controversy lately over the Odyssey, with Christopher Nolan's highly anticipated take on the story soon approaching, and I haven't exactly been quiet about my feelings regarding what we've seen of it. The narrative storytelling may very well be great, but from what we can judge so far, I'm not seeing anything worth getting excited about, which is a huge shame because this project had tremendous potential. We could have gotten a gorgeously authentic historical epic, an utterly immersive cinematic event, but instead, everything from the casting, the dialogue, the cinematography, and, most importantly for me, the production and costume design, looks like it was based on the first thing an AI regurgitated when prompted to imagine the Odyssey as a gritty modern blockbuster. But I'm not here to talk about Nolan's take on this story. I can't help but vent my frustration and disappointment when I get the chance, but contrary to the accusations of Nolan's defenders, I don't just love being negative about everything, and to prove as much, I opted to forego another video complaining about Nolan's unfortunate choices and instead spend my time spreading the word about something I absolutely adore. If you're not already familiar with Epic the Musical, you need to amend that as soon as possible. If you're not aware, it's a musical adaptation of the Odyssey created by the young independent musician Jorge Rivera Herranz and made popular thanks to TikTok. It's currently just a series of concept albums, though it's been given countless gorgeous animatics by a wide variety of artists, and it was recently announced that Jerry Bruckheimer has signed on to produce an animated film adaptation that is now being shopped around to animation studios. I've been aware of this project's existence for some time, but for whatever reason, I never decided to check it out until the most recent trailer of Nolan's Odyssey got me wondering if an adaptation of this version of the story would be worth getting more excited for than the one we're getting this year. And now, having finally experienced it for myself, I cannot begin to express how much more excited I am for this emotionally powerful, thematically compelling, and musically brilliant masterpiece to come to the big screen than I am for Nolan's cheap and generic-looking vanity project. To give you an idea how obsessed with this story I've been, I didn't go a single day without listening to or watching the entire thing for a whole week after I first experienced it. And the main reason I stopped watching or listening to the whole thing each day is only because I started spending my time making this video instead. I cannot exaggerate how deeply it has resonated with me, and I don't know that I can fully articulate why. Of course, since I'm making this video, I guess I have to try. For one thing, this story epitomizes all the kinds of stories I most loved and wanted to write myself growing up. In fact, it feels like I've been looking for epic my entire life and didn't even know it. For another, though I don't generally gravitate to musicals because they're not typically on my wavelength, this is very much my kind of story and my kind of music, and I can't deny something incredible happens when a powerful narrative and powerful music come together. But if you know me and this channel, you know I love stories most of all for their themes, for what they can teach us about ourselves. And the greatest reason I love Epic so much is all that it has to say about our humanity. So of course, that's what I'm going to talk about today. Now, this video might be a bit different from most of my deep dives because I tend to like to have a clear specific point to them, one that I don't feel has already been covered to death by the internet. However, in this case, I'm likely going to ramble a bit, and I doubt I'm going to say much that others in the Epic fandom haven't already articulated better. I'm not making this video because I feel I have a totally original thesis to make, but mainly because I cannot think of another time in my life I have been this obsessed with anything, so I have to talk about it and hopefully get someone else to check it out for the first time. So even more so than usual, I'm just thinking out loud here, so if you like my brain vomit, you know where the like and subscribe buttons are. Now without further ado, let's dive into one of the most unique, exciting, thematically rich, and emotionally impactful pieces of storytelling I have ever experienced in any medium. Oh, and of course, spoilers ahead. You may think this warning doesn't apply to you if you have a passing familiarity with the Odyssey, but seriously, there are some massive emotional punches here that you'll want to experience for yourself, so if you haven't watched it, look it up on YouTube right now and come back to this video as soon as you finish it. Alright, on with the show. The central thematic question of this story is found in the chorus of the song Just a Man, repeated again and again throughout the musical. When does a man become a monster? From his first horrific act of the story, Odysseus wrestles with this question until he resolves to let himself become the monster he needs to be to do whatever it takes to get home. Now this arc may seem straightforward enough, but my perspective on it has changed since my first time listening to it. It's easy to look at Odysseus' journey as that of a good man gradually abandoning his principles and becoming a monster. But after enough time spent with these characters, I've realized it's actually that of a man realizing he's already become a monster and wondering if it's possible to change and atone while still fighting for what he loves. See, the Odysseus we meet at the beginning is no principled pacifist, but a warrior, not afraid to use any means necessary to defeat his enemies. Obeying Zeus's command to kill Hector's infant son may have been the first atrocity we witness him commit, but it is by no means the first test of his character or a mere foreshadowing of his descent to come, as it may seem to us. It is just the moment that forces him to confront the monster that's been growing within him for the past decade. And afterward, it's not just this horrific action that haunts him. As he sings in Just a Man, he wonders if every man he's slain will haunt him, not just this child. And much later in Monster, he compares his own plot to use the Trojan horse to sack the city to the actions of Polyphemus and Circe. The chorus of Just a Man is not suggesting his infanticide is the line he can't come back from, but asking if he has already crossed that line long ago without even realizing it. So while it's easy to see the merciful, relatively pacifistic Odysseus of the rest of Act 1 as his starting point, it's actually a dramatic shift in his character triggered by his haunting guilt. This is made clear by Athena chastising him for his newfound trusting attitude in her introduction. Polites inspired him with his mantra of open arms, and when he dies, Odysseus determines to honor his friend's memory by taking on his worldview. Unfortunately, when it proves difficult to live by such a motto in a ruthless world, he ultimately gives up on it and accepts the monster he knows is already inside him. See, there are two competing philosophies in epic, each encapsulated by their own recurring song. I already mentioned the first, that being Open Arms, sung by Odysseus' friend Polites, and the other is Ruthlessness, our introduction to the vengeful Poseidon. These two songs are frequently called back to throughout the musical as Odysseus is torn between his desire to atone for his atrocities and honor his fallen friend by living with empathy and mercy for his enemies, and the pragmatic need to be ruthless to save the lives of his friends and accomplish his goals. As much as Odysseus wants to be able to live by his friend's philosophy, he is increasingly convinced that doing so will only get him and his men killed in a world ruled by ruthlessness. His mercy on Polyphemus, the act that marks his rejection of his inner monster, ultimately brings down Poseidon's wrath on them, becoming his biggest regret and the reason he decides to embrace his inner monster. Then, in the end, it is only by being ruthless to Poseidon that he is able to return home, and of course his ruthlessness to the suitor saves the lives of his family. So the story could be seen as a dark message that kindness and compassion are weakness, were it not for the fact that his ruthlessness also loses him all of his friends, as he finds himself on a slippery slope in which everyone around him becomes tools or obstacles in his single-minded quest to get home. The ideological debate here is approached with incredible nuance, as we see both the undeniable effectiveness and the tremendous cost of sacrificing your humanity. And I suppose the biggest question is whether or not the cost is worth it, but I'll come back to that question at the end of the video. However, while mercy and ruthlessness are the story's most overt pair of opposing ideals, I think there is another battle of ideas happening beneath the surface here, and the fascinating part of this whole exploration is how the two methods of approaching the world I already described relate to the two opposing attributes I see at war in the story. Odysseus' arc is so tragic, in large part because it was not as inevitable as it may initially seem. Odysseus comes to see mercy as weakness, but the truth is, his true weakness is one that barely gets addressed in the story, though it is in fact a hidden central theme of the whole narrative, one only explicitly mentioned in one song. In Thunderbringer, Zeus, rather suggestively, sings of exposing Odysseus' pride, though this song isn't often thought of as being nearly as crucial to the story's themes as ruthlessness because it's never really called back to in context of the themes and Odysseus' character. I think it gives a tremendous insight into what this story's all about. Zeus recognizes what even Odysseus cannot recognize in himself, and presents him with a choice that will reveal the pride within him, the pride that forces him to put his own ends above all else. Zeus seems to indicate, and I would argue, this was his fundamental weakness. But because pride is inherently difficult for one to recognize and root out in oneself, he had instead identified his guilt as his weakness. After all, this weakness is much easier to stamp out. Though Odysseus decides this guilt and his friend's comforting philosophy is what's keeping him and his crew from overcoming their obstacles, when looking back at all their major setbacks, it's hard to find many examples of mercy making their problems any worse. As I've mentioned, he frequently reflects or is reminded that none of this would have happened if he had just killed the Cyclops, but while that might be true, it is just as likely that none of this would have happened if he had not felt the prideful need to brag to the Cyclops and identify himself by name after leaving him blind. While you could argue his trust in his crew led them to opening the windbag, you could also argue that his prideful demands for unquestioning devotion and refusal to hear out his crew's concerns led them to betray his trust. In other words, he only trusted them in the sense that he expected them to obey him, but he didn't show them that he trusted their character or choices, and thus didn't give them reason to trust him. And finally, while his apology to Poseidon was likely the most honest attempt at an apology he could give, had he been willing to truly humble himself and offer a more penitent plea for forgiveness, it's possible the vengeful god might have gone a little easier on them as he suggested he might. These were all of the major setbacks caused by the decisions of Odysseus or his crew, and all of them were caused at least as much by his pride as by his mercy or faith in others. Also, not only was his pride more harmful than his mercy, but his mercy and openness actually proved quite useful at times. After all, it was his mercy on Circe and willingness to open up to her that allowed her to help them get to the underworld, though I suppose it's debatable how helpful that ultimately turned out to be. And later, we see his ruthlessness is what forces his crew to turn against him, because as soon as you're willing to see people as no more than obstacles, it's all too easy for friends and allies to fall into that category as well. So in the end, not only did his pride cause all their suffering, but to preserve itself, it convinced Odysseus that what might have been their greatest strength was actually the problem. Thus, it was his pride that made him a monster and led him to be consumed by ruthlessness, eventually leading to the destruction of his crew and his 7-year imprisonment. But Odysseus is not the only character whose pride leads him to ruthlessness. In fact, I would suggest it is the fundamental motivation of all the gods in this story. I mean, Zeus, for all his condemnation of mortal pride, is pretty much the embodiment of pride himself, nearly murdering his favorite child because she won his challenge. After all, pride must always tear down the pride of others, so the ultimate epitome of pride must of course eradicate it wherever he finds it. However, I find the more interesting example of this to be Poseidon. When he first arrives to torment Odysseus in ruthlessness, he appears to be an angry father out to avenge his son. But later, in Get in the Water, he makes it clear that his vendetta is purely motivated by pride. He's not trying to punish the man who hurt his child. He just can't let anyone go around saying they got away with crippling his offspring and then evaded his wrath. This explains why he said Odysseus could have avoided trouble with him by killing Polyphemus. If he was really upset about what happened, then I'm sure if he had found his son dead, he would have stopped at nothing to avenge him, and I find it hard to believe it would have been much harder for him to track him down had he not known his name. No, he's not out to avenge a loved one, at least not entirely. He just can't let people, including his other children who now know who blinded their brother, think he let the guy get away with it. To me, the most interesting moment for his character is when Odysseus asks why he can't let this go and suggests he learn to forgive. I expected him to react with anger or possibly even bitter amusement, as you'd expect if this was purely personal. But Poseidon's reaction is strangely somber, as if he doesn't want to be doing this, as if he's bound by some divine law that requires the gods to defend their pride and keep mortals in check at all costs. This reframes his whole philosophy as not a pragmatic way of going about life or a twisted form of love, but as an existential necessity for him, a law he must live by as a god, one which Odysseus can abandon if he can only abandon his pride. And of course, I can't not talk about Athena, who is clearly motivated by her own pride as well in the beginning, as Odysseus brutally points out in My Goodbye. However, after years of guilt for abandoning her friend, we see her pride give way to her love for Odysseus and his son in the Wisdom Saga, leading her to challenge her father's pride, which of course pisses him off, before possibly inspiring him to have an off-screen change of heart. With her own change of heart, she also has a change of worldview, as, and I can only wonder, she expresses her regret for what she taught Odysseus and her hope for a world where empathy, not ruthlessness, is the rule. It seems she stops to imagine what kind of world she's actually been fighting for all along and reconsiders what it will take to make such a world a reality. And perhaps she concludes that ruthlessness only begets more ruthlessness, and only when love replaces pride can kindness and compassion become the norm. So then, does love lead to empathy and mercy as pride leads to ruthlessness? Well, sadly, it would seem not necessarily. After all, Odysseus is very much driven by love. Pride may have been his greatest weakness, but it was never his fundamental motivation. Besides, it seems to me that Zeus's exposure of Odysseus' pride also shattered it, as he seems very much humbled in his time on Calypso's island, where he is once again tormented by his guilt and abandons all his goals, along with any pretense of moral superiority through either mercy or ruthlessness. From then on, I struggle to find examples of actions motivated by pride on his part, and he even approaches Poseidon with far more humility in his second interaction with him. Nevertheless, he is clearly as ruthless as ever when he tortures the defeated god and slaughters the suitors. So while it is easy to abandon mercy for ruthlessness when you are ruled by pride, love can clearly be just as ruthless. And this, of course, begs the question, is ruthlessness justified when motivated by love? We tend to see love as the greatest attribute and motivation one can have. But though Zeus hit the nail on the head when he identified Odysseus' pride, you'd probably be right to argue that it was his love for and devotion to his family that led Odysseus to make the choice he did. It was love that motivated him to go to such gruesome lengths to defeat Poseidon and mercilessly destroy all the men who threatened his loved ones. And of course, going back to the beginning, it was his love for his family that allowed him to justify infanticide. Were all these actions justified? And perhaps more importantly, did committing such actions make him a monster? And if so, was the love that motivated them ever truly noble and selfless? And that leads us to the ending, which is one of the most emotionally powerful and thematically complicated endings to a story I have ever seen. I initially felt it might have been a bit too sweet and optimistic considering everything that led up to it and what Odysseus has become, but the more I thought about it, the less it feels like a straightforward happily ever after. It is joyful and triumphant, but there's still something bittersweet about it, and it doesn't claim that Odysseus isn't a monster for what he's done, forever haunted by his actions. In fact, in Would You Fall in Love with Me Again, it seems to me that Odysseus is suddenly struck with guilt, feeling he doesn't deserve to be happy with Penelope after all he's done, and that she deserves better than the monster he's become. However, as Jorge himself has discussed in talking about the making of this song, Penelope proves that she is not a passive prize to serve his character arc one way or the other, as she surprises him with her own ruthless love for him in spite of all he's done. She argues that no matter what he's done, what he's become, contrary to the words of the prophet that he's surely remembering, he's still the man that she's been waiting for 20 years, and she won't give up on him any more easily than he gave up on getting back to her. For me, this ending manages to be incredibly hopeful and leave me teary-eyed with joy while still wrestling with difficult questions. Does love justify such ruthlessness as Odysseus demonstrates to return to and protect his family? Does ruthlessness alone make a man a monster, or is it pride? And are monsters capable and deserving of love? I don't have the answers to these questions, and the story doesn't claim to have them either, but it makes you ask them. And any story that can make you wrestle with such profound questions has done the best thing a story can do in my book. Like I said, this video does not have quite as clear and direct of a thesis as I like to have in these deep dives, but I hope I've revealed something you may not have considered before in this incredible story. And if I just convinced you to give it a watch or listen, I'll be happy. What Jorge created is not only a brilliant work of musical storytelling that manages to elicit a wide range of profoundly deep emotions, but it also provides a powerful exploration of the cost of compassion and trust in a world of ruthlessness, and the cost of ruthlessness on our humanity. It explores the power of love and the danger of pride, what makes men into monsters, and whether monsters can still give and receive love. Ultimately, it takes an honest look at the world we live in, but it still asks if it's possible to build a better one. And in a world of both cynicism and naivety, I'd argue that those are the stories we need most. But what do you think about Epic the Musical? What do you love most about it? How excited are you for it to be made into a film, and what are your hopes and fears for it? And of course, while not everything needs to be a competition, if you could only get one, would you rather see Epic as a film or Christopher Nolan's take on the Odyssey? As always, I'm just here to kick off the discussion, so I look forward to joining the conversation with you down in the comments. Until next time, just keep thinking out loud.